eligibility. It was a battle over whose stories were deemed worthy of leadership and whose were quietly erased. Jasmine didn't raise her voice, but what she said made the room freeze. She exposed not policy, but strategy, disguised discrimination coded into law. So what did Jasmine say that made Congress go silent and America sit up and listen? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. At exactly 5:32 a.m., before Washington, D.C. had even begun to wake, a sharp vibration shook Jasmine Crockett's phone off the edge of her nightstand. The screen flashed with a familiar alert, one she had set to bypass silent mode. A new federal bill had been introduced. Eyes still heavy with sleep, Jasmine dragged herself from bed, wrapped in a robe, and opened her laptop in the dim light. The subject line glared at her with surgical coldness. Federal Integrity and Eligibility Reform Act introduced. Summary attached. She paused. The name was too polished, too neutral. In her experience, legislation that used words like integrity and reform often meant something else entirely. She opened the summary file. Her eyes scanned the bullet points. By the end of the third clause, her fingers stopped typing. She froze, completely still. The coffee machine across the room hissed into silence. In front of her was a bill that, on the surface, seemed standard, but each line was an execution order hidden in plain sight. Clause 1. All candidates for federal office must provide evidence of 10 consecutive years of uninterrupted federal income tax contributions. Clause 2. No candidate may have received any form of government assistance, including but not limited to food stamps, housing support, unemployment benefits, or Medicaid at any point in their life. Clause 3. Candidates must not have any criminal history whatsoever, including expunged charges, juvenile offenses, or dismissed cases. Jasmine exhaled slowly, but the air felt heavy in her lungs. She whispered to herself, "That's not eligibility. That's engineered exclusion." Her voice broke the stillness like glass cracking under pressure. Within minutes, she was fully dressed and storming into her Capitol Hill office. The sky outside was still pitch black. Inside, the fluorescent lights overhead flickered on as she barked at her team, "Pull me census data, race, gender, and public benefits received from 2010 to 2020. Cross-check it with IRS tax records and federal candidacy eligibility." She didn't raise her voice, but the urgency in her tone made the walls feel like they were closing in. Her staff scattered into motion like a military unit on red alert. As her researchers dug in, Jasmine stood in front of the whiteboard, marker in hand. In bold red ink, she wrote one word across the top: erasure. Then she underlined it twice. The data came in fast, but each number felt like a stab to the chest. 83% of Black women between the ages of 30 and 55 had grown up in households that received SNAP benefits or Section 8 housing support. Nearly half of them had relied on public assistance at some point in their adult lives. Under the proposed bill, over 90% of them would be automatically disqualified from running for federal office. And the contrast was stark. 42% of white candidates would still qualify. Only 9% of Black candidates would meet the criteria. Jasmine gripped the back of her chair as she stared at the screen. Her voice was low and firm. This bill wasn't written to stop corruption. It was written to stop people like me. She walked back to the whiteboard and drew a triangle. At each point, she labeled the 3 new conditions: taxes, no welfare, no record. Then she added a circle around it and wrote, privilege-only zone. "This isn't about fairness," she said to her team. "It's about rewriting the rules of entry so that only the children of wealth, uninterrupted income, and perfect records are allowed in." The room was silent. Then she added, "They don't need to ban Black people with language. They just ban the roads we've taken to get here." As the sun finally breached the horizon, casting golden light across the Capitol dome, Jasmine Crockett wasn't basking in its glow. She was already digging into the shadows. Back in her office, the silence was broken only by the faint hum of computers and the hurried keystrokes of a staffer named Miguel, who had been working nonstop since dawn. He looked up, pale, holding something in his hand, like it was radioactive. "Representative," he said, voice tight, "we traced the metadata from the draft bill, and you're going to want to see this." Jasmine walked over, slowly, deliberately, like a soldier approaching a live bomb. Miguel turned the monitor. There it was in black and white. Project Eliminate. The file hadn't just come from anywhere. It was created, uploaded, and last modified on a secure drive in the legislative office of Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene. No code names, no euphemisms. Just the word eliminate, cold, unfiltered intent, sitting right in the open like it had nothing to fear. Jasmine's hand curled into a fist at her side, her knuckles whitening. She stared at the name on the screen as if it had insulted her mother to her face. For a moment, she said nothing. Then she leaned in close and whispered, "They weren't trying to fix the system. They were trying to erase the people inside it." Across the room, her team exchanged glances, the mood turning from disbelief to something darker, controlled fury. "Print it," she ordered. "Print every single version, every note, every edit. I want a forensic trail from the first word to the last period." Miguel nodded, already hitting keys. Outside, morning traffic honked faintly, but inside, the war had already started. Jasmine didn't need a press conference, not yet. She needed the truth, and this file was a smoking gun. Just as the printer began spitting out the damning pages, another alert pinged Jasmine's inbox. It was from an encrypted address, no name, no traceable signature. The subject line read only, "Confirmation, internal intentions of drafting team." She clicked it open, her heart pounding. Inside was a message, short and lethal. "I was one of the staffers assigned to code the draft eligibility filters. The goal was always to suppress low-income and minority candidates, particularly black women. The language was designed to look neutral. The algorithm was not." Jasmine's eyes scanned every line, absorbing it like a wound-absorbing salt. It wasn't a conspiracy theory. It was real. Someone inside had just confessed to weaponizing legislation with precision data. And now the evidence was in her hands. She printed the email and laid it beside the file draft. Together, they read like a blueprint for political genocide, one of opportunity, not blood. "They didn't just write a bill," she said, her voice shaking with control. "They engineered a purge, one that would disqualify entire communities by the metrics of their survival." Her staff stood frozen, watching the gravity settle like dust after an explosion. Jasmine reached into her drawer and pulled out a red pen. She circled the word eliminate on the file printout and wrote in the margin, "This is not reform. This is selection by exclusion." Then she looked up, eyes sharpened into blades. "And I'm going to expose every last piece of it." The emotional toll clung to the walls like static. No one spoke. No one needed to. They were no longer reacting. They were preparing. Jasmine straightened her shoulders and walked to the window. The city moved as if nothing had happened, as if democracy hadn't just been quietly poisoned on a congressional server. She whispered to the glass, not for herself, but for every girl who'd ever been told she was too loud, too poor, too black to lead. "If they think we'll let them delete us with a spreadsheet, they've chosen the wrong damn story." With damning evidence now in her possession, Jasmine Crockett prepared for the next war front. Not the courtroom, but the camera, where reputations are crafted and silence can be louder than law. It began, as many political ambushes do, in a crisp, air-conditioned Fox News studio bathed in red, white, and filtered approval. Marjorie Taylor Greene sat straight back beneath the chyron, fighting for integrity in Washington. Her tone was deceptively calm, but the venom behind her words seeped through like oil beneath polished marble. "This country was built by people who gave to it," she said, lips curling slightly. "And now we're supposed to be led by people who took from it?" The host nodded approvingly, barely concealing his satisfaction. Greene didn't pause. "Congress should be for contributors, those who've worked, paid taxes, built businesses, not for individuals who've lived off handouts and expect us to call it resilience." The message wasn't coded. It didn't have to be. It was a grenade disguised as policy, a direct swipe at anyone whose story didn't start in comfort. She finished with a chilling line, delivered as if she were reading a bedtime story. It's time we stop pretending that dependency is a qualification for leadership. That quote ricocheted across media outlets within minutes. Clips exploded across Twitter and Facebook, accompanied by incendiary captions. MTG calls out the welfare class in Congress. Greene, no more victims in office. But for Jasmine Crockett, it wasn't just a headline. It was an invitation to war. 6 hours later, under the cool lights of MSNBC's DC studio, Jasmine sat alone in front of a matte black backdrop. There was no decorative flag, no soft piano music, just the red light of the camera, glowing like a signal flare. The anchor barely finished his introduction before Jasmine leaned forward and spoke with the calm precision of someone sharpening a blade. "When I was 9, she began, my mother came home from the night shift and walked me to the corner store with an EBT card. She didn't look ashamed. She looked tired. She looked like someone trying to survive a country that always demanded more than she had." She turned directly to the camera. No script, no notes, just fury dressed in poise. "I used food stamps. I ate from free lunch programs. And I am not ashamed of that. I am proud of the fact that I came from struggle and still chose to serve." Her voice deepened with purpose. What Representative Greene said isn't just cruel. It's a symptom of a government that wants to be run only by the untouched, the untested, the unscarred. She thinks paying taxes is the only proof of contribution. But what about the people who gave this country their labor, their loyalty, their lives, without ever seeing a return? She paused, let that question settle like a weight on the room. If my childhood on Snap disqualifies me, then we're not measuring worth. We're gatekeeping humanity. She continued without blinking, her voice now steely and unflinching. "Let's tell the truth," she said. "This isn't about integrity. It's about invisibility. Greene wants a Congress that looks like a gated community. No renters, no debt, no broken histories. Just sanitized success stories. But here's the problem with that. This country was not built by sanitized stories. It was built by people who fell, who got back up, and who learned how to govern with compassion because they had to survive first." In the studio, the anchor sat still, eyes wide, almost reverent. No cue cards, no commercials. Just Crockett, reshaping the narrative in real time. "And let me say this," she added, her voice softening, but not weakening. "If standing here as someone who once relied on help makes me unworthy in Marjorie Taylor Greene's America, then maybe America needs to re-examine what worthy really means." The camera lingered as she looked down briefly, then raised her eyes with unmistakable defiance. "I didn't inherit a platform. I built one. With truth, grit, and food stamps. And I will never apologize for that." Every line she spoke that night would be clipped, quoted, and carved into the week's headlines. But in that moment, before the applause, before the backlash, Jasmine Crockett sat calm, steady, and unbending, because she had just turned an insult into an indictment and a smear into a spotlight. And for the first time in a long time, millions of Americans who'd once felt erased saw a piece of themselves staring back through the screen, unapologetic, unfiltered, and absolutely unafraid. The lights of the studio had faded, but the fire Jasmine Crockett lit refused to die. Instead, it surged into the halls of Congress, demanding a stage that no committee could ignore. The hearing was scheduled for 9 a.m., but by 6:30, people were already gathering on the Capitol lawn. Some held handmade signs, "We belong." Food stamps raised leaders too. Erase the bill, not the people. Others simply stood in silence, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the grand white building, as if waiting for it to blink. Inside, the tension was suffocating. Every hallway echoed with whispered predictions. Staffers scrambled, camera crews adjusted tripods, and aides distributed bottled water that no one drank. This wasn't just another policy review. This was the moment the country would be forced to look in the mirror. Jasmine Crockett entered the chamber with the gravity of someone walking into a courtroom, where the verdict would be national memory. She wore black, not for mourning, but for clarity. Every line on her suit was sharp. No brooch, no flag pin. Her only accessory was a red folder clenched tightly in her left hand. In it, the leaked documents, the metadata, the anonymous email. But today wasn't about papers. It was about presence. She moved through the rows of lawmakers like a storm cloud passing over a dry plain, unavoidable, electric, and full of charge. Some glanced at her, others refused. A few looked like they were preparing to be dismantled. She took her seat. The microphones were already live. The nation was already watching. She didn't begin with greetings or formality. She looked directly into the lens of the center camera, her voice level, low and deliberate, each word calibrated like a drumbeat. I am not here today for myself. She let it hang. The silence that followed was a silence no one dared fill. Then, I am here for the ones you don't see. The ones whose names never make it onto ballots, not because they lack the will, but because systems were built to ensure they'd never qualify. Her voice remained calm, but there was iron beneath it. This bill was not written to promote fairness. It was written to enforce memory, one narrow, privileged version of who deserves to lead. She held up the bill, her fingers pressing the pages like a surgeon holding something diseased. 10 years of uninterrupted taxes, no history of assistance, no record, no matter how long ago or how unjust the charge. Let me be clear, these are not standards, these are weapons. This bill is a blueprint for selective citizenship, drawn not in ink, but in data points designed to erase. She placed the bill down, gently, not with rage but with surgical precision. Then she leaned forward. I grew up watching my mother carry 2 jobs and an EBT card. I grew up in a household that needed help, and received it. Not because we were lazy, not because we were broken, but because the country we loved told us that temporary need did not mean permanent disqualification. Her voice cracked just slightly, not from weakness, but from the immense weight of truth. She steadied herself. If this bill had existed when I was a child, the version of me that stands before you today would have been locked out before I ever stepped in. Then she added slower, lower. And that was the point, wasn't it? A murmur rippled across the chamber. No one spoke to stop her. Even her critics sat frozen, unwilling to interrupt what they knew would echo far beyond the room. She raised her eyes again. I testify today for those who are being legislated into silence. I speak for every child whose parents told them, one day, you could serve, and who now must watch a law try to render that dream impossible, not because they are incapable, but because they were inconvenient to someone else's vision of America. Her final line wasn't shouted. It was whispered with clarity so sharp it could have carved stone. I'm not just testifying for myself. I'm testifying for the erased. And with that, she sat back, leaving not just her words, but their weight, hanging in the air like judgment. The chamber had gone quiet, not out of respect, but because something irreversible was beginning to stir, and Jasmine Crockett was at the center of it, unfolding a reckoning disguised as legislation. She held the printed bill with both hands, the pages no longer trembling, but firm, like a courtroom exhibit. Her voice was steady, clipped, and deliberate, as if she were chiseling the words into marble. Let's not pretend this is just policy, she said. Let's read it for what it truly is. A blueprint for exclusion disguised as a test of integrity. She lifted her eyes. Clause 1. 10 consecutive years of federal tax contributions. She paused. So let's talk about someone who wouldn't pass. She held the room with silence, then dropped the name. Barack Obama. The reaction wasn't vocal, but it rippled. An audible shift in posture, a sudden intake of breath. Raised by a single mother, she continued, eyes narrowing, who needed food stamps to keep the lights on. Under this law, he would not have met your standard. She moved forward with the bill still in her hands, like a witness carrying proof of a crime. Clause 2. No history of receiving public assistance. Ever. She let the weight of the word ever hang. Doctor? Kenyatta Ross, she continued, first-generation college student, graduated Harvard Medical School, now a trauma surgeon who rebuilt her community hospital. She walked slowly across the chamber, eyes locked on the committee. She received Medicaid while studying and working overnight shifts to survive. This bill would erase her before she could ever run. She raised her voice just slightly, enough to slice through the hush. Not because she isn't intelligent, not because she isn't capable, but because she once said, "I need help." She stopped in front of her seat, bill at her side, and stared down its authors like a verdict. Then her tone dropped, tighter, colder. Clause 3, no criminal history, including expunged or dismissed records. She didn't blink. Sergeant Malik Jones, U.S. Army, 2 tours, Bronze Star, came back with PTSD, 1 arrest after a panic episode at a gas station, charges dismissed, record sealed. Her voice caught slightly, not from weakness, but from fury that had found its focus. Today, he runs a crisis intervention program for fellow veterans. He saves lives, but this bill would call him unfit to lead. She didn't ask permission to pause. She let the weight of that truth sit, heavy and unforgiving. Then slowly, she turned her body to face the full chamber. Her voice didn't rise. It dropped. Lower, sharper, unmistakable. So let me ask you this. Who are we really trying to keep off the ballot? She took 1 step forward. People with dirty records, or people with real ones? Her eyes scanned the faces around her, some stone, some crumbling. People with scars from battlefields and courtrooms and poverty lines, or people whose only crime was surviving in a system that already tried to push them out. The silence in the room was no longer about discipline. It was about discomfort. Jasmine held them there, refusing to let them look away. Are we punishing imperfection or banning the very path most Americans have to take to get here? She took a breath, not to calm herself, but to aim. Her final line wasn't theatrical. It was clean, precise, and lethal. We say we want leaders who understand the people, but when those people apply, we write laws to keep them out. And with that, she lowered the bill onto the table like it had just finished testifying for itself. The chamber was still reeling from the examples Jasmine had laid bare, but the silence was short-lived, fractured by a slow, deliberate clearing of the throat from across the aisle, followed by a voice laced with contempt disguised as composure. Marjorie Taylor Greene didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her tone carried something colder than volume, condescension dressed as control. "Congresswoman Crockett," she began, leaning slightly forward with a smirk that curled just enough to be seen by the cameras, "you've made it very clear that your message today is rooted in emotion." She paused, glancing sideways to the committee, letting her words linger like the scent of smoke in a closed room. "But I didn't come here to listen to trauma stories. I came here to talk about qualifications." Her fingers tapped rhythmically on the table, each beat an act of deliberate provocation. "We cannot build a government on feelings and past hardship," she continued, tone crisp as ice. "We need a Congress of professionals, not perpetual victims, weaponizing race at every turn." Then came the final blow, the line she delivered like it was rehearsed. "Stop playing the race card. I'm asking for quality, not another emotional performance." The words landed like a slap. One meant not just to insult, but to invalidate everything that had come before. There was a pause, not out of confusion, but because the oxygen seemed to thin. And in that pause, Jasmine Crockett rose. Not hurriedly, not with fury, but with the slow, terrifying stillness of someone who'd been here before. She didn't speak at first. She let Greene's words echo in their own staleness, hanging like a curtain of dust before a storm. Then she walked forward, steady, eyes locked not on Greene, but on the committee, on the camera, on the country. "Let me be absolutely clear," she said, voice low and level, yet sharp enough to cut through steel. "When Black and brown communities are filtered out by the exact criteria that only privilege can meet, that's not standards. That's sabotage." She unfolded the bill again, tapping it gently. "You didn't write this to test qualification. You wrote it to codify exclusion." Her gaze finally shifted, slow, deliberate, to Greene. "You say I'm emotional. I say I'm accurate." The room didn't move. No one dared. "You say, don't make this about race. But how convenient when the outcome just happens to disqualify 91% of Black women while preserving the eligibility of the very same structure that has kept them out for generations." She stepped closer to the microphone. The red light gleamed on the lens, catching the weight of every syllable. "When history repeats itself quietly, we call it bureaucracy. When it repeats itself boldly, we call it segregation. Her voice did not rise, but it deepened, like a river darkening before a flood. This bill is not new. It is just Jim Crow in a blazer. Polished, updated, denied. The words detonated one after another, not shouted, but delivered with a calm so deadly it felt like a scalpel. She inhaled, then delivered the final line like a sentence handed down from history itself. And if you think calling that out is playing a card, then maybe it's because you've never sat at a table where the deck was rigged. And with that, she stepped back, not defeated, but coiled, waiting. The air was electric. The silence afterward wasn't peaceful. It was stunned. The chamber had been silent in the wake of Jasmine's indictment, but silence, like truth, makes some people nervous. And so Marjorie Taylor Greene did what power always does when it begins to feel cornered. She shut the door. Jasmine's voice broke the quiet like a command. She didn't raise it. She didn't need to. "Chair," she said, turning slightly toward the panel, "I request to call Sergeant First Class Alma Price as a witness before this body." Her tone was respectful, but absolute. She is a retired Army veteran, 32 years of decorated service, Bronze Star, 2 deployments. She's here to speak not just as a soldier, but as someone who lived what this bill punishes. The camera turned briefly toward the woman seated behind Jasmine. Alma Price sat straight-backed in her pressed navy jacket, silver hair tied tight, a thin folder in her lap, and a calm, almost military stillness in her eyes. She didn't blink. She didn't smile. She was prepared, not to speak for herself, but for those long forgotten. But just as the chair opened his mouth to respond, another voice cut through the room, flat and dismissive. "Objection," Marjorie Taylor Greene said, not looking up from her binder. Her voice was steady, her face unreadable. "The proposed witness is not qualified under House Rule 9B. She is neither an expert on constitutional law nor an elected official." She paused, then added with a thin smile that didn't reach her eyes, "With all due respect, this hearing is about eligibility, not autobiography." A few staffers shifted in their seats. A thin ripple of tension rolled through the chamber like static. The chair hesitated, visibly uncomfortable, then gave the ruling, "Objection sustained. The witness is disqualified from testifying." There was no noise from the gallery, just a stillness that suddenly felt suffocating. Jasmine turned, slowly, deliberately. Her hand rested on the table, steady as a heartbeat. "Disqualified," she repeated softly. "That's what you're calling her?" She walked to the edge of her desk, just close enough that her voice carried like thunder restrained. "She qualified to be deployed into combat zones under fire, qualified to follow orders that risked her life, qualified to salute the same flag that flies over this building." Her voice didn't waver. It deepened. She stood guard while others slept. She buried brothers in uniform. She lived through bullets, trauma, and silence. Jasmine paused, just long enough for the room to realize it was holding its breath. Then she said, "But because she accepted housing assistance after coming home, you say she is not qualified to testify?" Her words were no longer sharp. They were surgical. She was qualified to die for this country, but not qualified to speak in front of it? It wasn't a question. It was an indictment. Her eyes scanned the room slowly, one face at a time, and no one met her gaze. She looked back to Alma Price, who had not moved. The veteran sat still, composed, her hands folded over the folder in her lap like she was still holding a rifle. Her face didn't show pain. But Jasmine knew better. This wasn't just about dignity. It was about erasure. A system that would praise a woman in uniform on Veterans Day, only to silence her when she tried to speak on her own terms. Jasmine's voice dropped lower, a warning cloaked in calm. "If this is how we treat those who served, imagine how we treat those who never wore a uniform, but dared to dream of leading." Her hand rested over the bill again. "This isn't eligibility. This is disqualification by design." And with that, she sat down, slowly, intentionally. She didn't need applause. She didn't need affirmation. She had just exposed something raw, brutal, and undeniable, and no procedural objection could put it back in its box. The denial of a soldier's voice had left the room cold, But Jasmine Crockett wasn't finished. She hadn't just come to defend the wounded, she'd come to expose the architects of the wound itself. She opened the red folder slowly, the room watching her fingers like they were unraveling a confession. Inside it was a single printed page, but the way she held it, carefully, deliberately, it felt as if she were holding something radioactive. She stepped forward to the microphone without a word. Her silence didn't just command attention, it cornered it. "What I'm about to read," she said, her voice low, composed, "comes from an internal email sent from within the office of Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene." The statement alone rippled like static across the hearing room. She didn't pause for shock. She didn't perform. She continued. The message was sent during the early drafting stage of the Federal Integrity and Eligibility Reform Act, and it was never meant for public eyes. She raised the paper, facing it outward so the press gallery could zoom in on the highlighted text. It reads, and I quote directly, "Ensure exclusion algorithms prioritize low-income Black women, particularly those with Section 8 or housing voucher records. These profiles show low legal resistance and minimal public defense risk." The words landed like a body hitting concrete. The silence was not polite. It was stunned. The kind of silence that empties air from the room. Jasmine remained perfectly still. Her voice didn't rise, it dropped. This wasn't an accident. This was an instruction. She placed the paper gently on the witness table, her hand resting on it like a seal of judgment. These weren't metrics. They were marching orders. And they didn't come from anonymous trolls or fringe groups. They came from inside this building, from a sitting member's legislative office. She looked straight across the room, eyes locked on nothing and everything. And the people targeted weren't criminals. They weren't unqualified. They were simply demographically convenient to remove. For a moment, the walls of the Capitol felt too tight, as if even the architecture itself knew something was wrong. Reporters began typing furiously, camera shutters clicked, but Jasmine's voice cut through the noise like a slow blade. "You didn't build this bill to protect the integrity of elections. You built it to erase the humanity of those who've struggled and survived." She lifted her chin slightly, eyes blazing, not with rage, but with relentless clarity. "You didn't expect this email to see daylight. You thought bureaucracy would bury it, that America wouldn't notice if the ballot box got a little narrower, as long as it was done in the language of reform." She tapped the page once. The sound echoed louder than it should have. But today, that lie has a timestamp, a sender, and a motive. Then she stared down the table, straight toward Greene without flinching. "So the question is no longer, was this intentional? The question now is, what will you do with the truth now that it's standing in front of you?" And then she stepped back. The page stayed on the table. It didn't need her anymore. It was already burning. The weight of the exposed email still hung in the air like smoke from a controlled detonation. But some fires don't wait for facts to settle. They flare from within, fueled by pride, fear, and the instinct to deflect. Marjorie Taylor Greene slammed her palm against the hardwood desk with a force that broke the stillness like a gunshot. Her voice rose fast, sharp, and jagged. Not calm, not controlled. "I'm done listening to this," she barked, her chest heaving slightly as her fury surged faster than her breath. "I will not be painted as a bigot because I was born white and successful." Her eyes darted across the room, looking for nods that never came. She pressed forward, fists clenched, as if outrage alone could hold her upright. "This isn't about race. This is about responsibility," she snapped, voice cracking under its own weight. "You keep implying that success is privilege, that structure is oppression. But maybe the real problem is people who don't want to work as hard as I did." She jabbed a finger in Jasmine's direction. "Not with policy, but with personal resentment. Stop blaming people like me for a system we didn't create." The silence that followed was suffocating, not out of awe but recoil. The air itself had stiffened, coiled tight, holding the room hostage. Jasmine didn't speak right away. She let the echo of Greene's voice die naturally, let it ring and wilt on its own. Then she leaned forward, slowly, deliberately, as if lowering a scalpel, not to cut, but to reveal. Her voice was quiet, clear, and devastating. Congresswoman Greene, she said, I never once mentioned your name when I spoke of systems. I never once said the word white. She paused not to hesitate, but to let the truth breathe. I spoke of laws, of data, of outcomes. I named no villain, no race, no face. But if what I described made you uncomfortable, made you feel exposed, then I suggest you ask why. Her tone didn't mock, it didn't accuse. It held up a mirror and asked the room to look. I did not say you were the problem, she continued, softer now, more precise. But if you felt yourself in the story of exclusion, then perhaps you've recognized something that was never mine to place on you. The room seemed to narrow around her words. Greene was still standing, but her fury now looked isolated, like a signal sent into static. Reflection, Jasmine said, is not an attack. It's a reckoning. She folded her hands slowly in front of her, not in defiance but in composure. Guilt often shouts the loudest in rooms where truth only needs to whisper. And she said nothing more. The silence after that was different. Not stunned, but seismic. The hearing chamber had gone quiet, but the silence didn't last long. It spilled out of the building and shattered in the streets, where truth, once spoken aloud, could no longer be ignored. By dawn the next day, the streets were no longer still. In Washington, D.C., protesters gathered outside the Capitol with signs that screamed into the wind. We belong. You can't ban our stories. Jim Crow in a suit still smells like smoke. They came not just in hundreds, but in waves. Mothers with children on their hips, veterans in worn uniforms, college students with their tuition bills folded in their pockets like protest badges. Some marched in silence. Others chanted with hoarse, angry voices. The morning news tried to stay neutral, calling it a coordinated demonstration. But the footage told a different story. This was a reckoning. Jasmine Crockett's words from the hearing played on loop across every screen. She was qualified to die for this country, but not to lead it? That sentence had cracked something in the public. Now the people were pouring through it. By afternoon, it wasn't just D.C., Chicago, Atlanta, Oakland, Detroit, Philadelphia, Houston, and parts of rural Kansas. Yes, Kansas had taken to the streets. Not in riots, in testimony, in breathless, furious movement. At a subway station in Brooklyn, a group of nurses blocked the turnstiles holding banners with state Medicaid cards taped to them, each labeled with the words, disqualified under this bill. In front of City Hall in Los Angeles, an elderly woman sat quietly in a folding chair, holding a photograph of her younger self in military fatigues. A sign at her feet read, "You thanked me for my service. Now you silence my vote." Cameras caught it, and the image went viral within an hour. Jasmine hadn't just spoken. She'd struck a chord buried so deep in American soil that when it rang, the entire country trembled. Civil rights organizations were the first to mobilize. Within 24 hours of the hearing, the Southern Poverty Law Center, the ACLU, and Color of Change issued joint statements calling the bill a coded resurrection of voter disenfranchisement. Planned Parenthood joined, Human Rights Campaign, Unidas US, the National Council of Churches. Even more striking, the American Legion, typically slow to engage in legislative disputes, released a rare statement from its national office. Any law that excludes a veteran from political service on the basis of poverty or trauma is not a law born of patriotism. It is a betrayal of it. That line landed like a bomb. For once, the usual talking points crumbled beneath the weight of moral clarity. Suddenly, the bill didn't look like a debate. It looked like an attack, and Jasmine had been the only one brave enough to call it by name. Grassroots organizations followed suit. In Atlanta, a coalition of black sororities filed an open letter to Congress titled, "You Will Not Erase Us Quietly." In Houston, a network of first-generation immigrant women organized a midnight candlelight protest in front of the federal courthouse. No music, no slogans, just silence, and signs written in 5 languages that all meant the same thing. We are not your political collateral. In Oakland, an LGBTQ plus veterans group staged a sit-in at the state capitol, reading aloud the names of service members who had received public housing support upon returning home. When security tried to disperse them, The oldest veteran stood and said, "If I could survive Vietnam, I can survive your discomfort." Inside law offices across the country, legal minds worked through the night. At the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the lights never turned off. Attorneys pored over the bill's language, searching for precedents and pressure points. It didn't take long. A memo leaked by a junior associate surfaced online with a title that said it all. The disqualification bill is unconstitutional by design. It outlined how the bill violated the Equal Protection Clause, the Voting Rights Act, and, in spirit, if not yet in statute, the 13th Amendment. By noon the next day, that memo was no longer private. A coalition of legal advocacy groups, including the Brennan Center for Justice and Latino Justice, filed a joint emergency injunction with the United States Supreme Court, arguing that the bill must be suspended immediately. And in their 97-page brief, they did something unusual. They cited Jasmine Crockett's hearing word for word. In Section 4, Paragraph 9, the brief quoted her line in bold, "This bill is not eligibility. It is erasure with a polished header." Below it, the attorneys wrote, "When elected officials become the last line of defense against systemic exclusion, the court must act not as referee, but as shield." It was a legal filing, yes, but it read like history cracking open. At the same time, networks could barely keep up with coverage. CNN hosted a town hall with veterans disqualified by the bill. MSNBC brought in single mothers who'd once lived in Section 8 housing, now nurses, counselors, professors, none of whom would be eligible under the proposed criteria. Fox News tried to pivot, calling the bill an attempt to restore order to candidate requirements, but even some of their usual commentators hesitated. One former Marine, now a contributor, paused on air and said, "I don't know. I mean, if my kid grows up needing food stamps, does that mean she doesn't get to lead? That's not the America I swore to protect." Every hour brought more voices, not shouting, not chaos, just clarity, the kind that can't be unheard once spoken. And through all of it, Jasmine stayed mostly silent. She issued no press statement. She gave no interviews. She walked the steps of the Capitol each day like a woman not waiting for a verdict, but walking straight into one. When asked by reporters outside her office if she planned to challenge the bill's sponsors directly, she only said this: "The country's already doing that." It wasn't deflection, it was truth. Jasmine hadn't sparked the fire. She had struck a match next to gasoline that had been leaking for decades. By the end of the week, over 3.8 million Americans had signed petitions demanding the bill's immediate withdrawal. Over 400 civic and veterans groups had filed formal statements of opposition, and the Supreme Court had placed the case on their expedited review docket, an extraordinary measure typically reserved for elections, war powers, or constitutional crises. But maybe, just maybe, this was all three. But even as the streets thundered with truth, what came next wasn't shouted through megaphones. It came softly, through a single man's voice, broadcast into millions of living rooms, like a confession carved out of guilt. It happened on a Tuesday evening, during prime time, when most of America was finishing dinner, flipping through news channels to catch a summary of the chaos. No one expected this. On CNN, a breaking banner flashed red: "Exclusive, former advisor to Rep. Greene speaks out." The screen split in two. On one side, the network's anchor, pale and bracing. On the other, a man in his late 40s, tie loose, face drawn, posture tight like he had carried this moment in his spine for years. His name was Daniel Kessler, former legislative data analyst in Greene's office. And tonight, he wasn't here to spin or deflect. He was here to detonate. "I wasn't just a number cruncher," he began, his voice even, but cracking just beneath the surface. "I was assigned to model the probability of disqualifying certain groups, using historical welfare data, housing records, even juvenile dependency programs. The language we used, it was sanitized, but the intent was not." The anchor leaned forward, but didn't interrupt. America held its breath. "I ran simulations that measured how many black women would be excluded from federal candidacy if we used certain eligibility filters," Daniel continued. "I flagged the results. They knew. They celebrated it. A tremor hit his voice. And I said nothing. The network aired it live with no cuts. Social media exploded. The hashtags turned into firestorms. Number sign he knew, number sign sanitized exclusion, number sign systemic design. But Daniel didn't flinch from the backlash. He leaned in. I was in the room when the document titled Project Eliminate Low-Base Candidates V2 was first circulated, he said. I heard the laughter. I heard the phrase, we're not stopping anyone, we're just raising the bar. He looked up at the camera, eyes glassed with something between shame and resolve. It was never about merit. It was always about memory, erasing those who carry it. His final sentence came like a courtroom blow. I didn't build the bomb, but I helped arm it, and I cannot stay silent while it detonates. Back in the studio, the anchor's voice caught in her throat. Mr. Kessler, she asked. Why now? Daniel didn't blink. Because I watched a congresswoman stand alone in a chamber filled with people trying to erase her, and she didn't flinch, so I won't either. By midnight, the clip had been viewed over 38 million times. MSNBC rebroadcast it in full. CBS ran a special report titled Exclusion by Design, the Political Architecture of Disqualification. Even Fox News couldn't ignore it. One guest analyst admitted, if even a fraction of what he says is true, this bill's future is in constitutional hospice. Op-eds surged. Editorial boards, once hesitant to take a stand, now issued clear denunciations of the bill. But beyond the media, beyond the analysis, something else shifted. Something quieter, heavier. The tone of the national debate collapsed under the weight of proof. In homes across America, people rewound the clip to one particular line. It was never about merit. It was always about memory, erasing those who carry it. That sentence didn't just indict a policy. It lit up the whole architecture of legislative exclusion that had gone unspoken for generations. Suddenly, people were asking the right question. What else has been designed this way? Capitol Hill panicked. Within 36 hours, several of Greene's aides were subpoenaed by the House Ethics Committee. A whistleblower hotline set up by a civil liberties watchdog group received over 200 tips in the first night, many from former staffers across party lines. Leaked memos, Slack messages, internal memos referencing demographic compliance sweeps. It wasn't just one man anymore. It was an avalanche. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just sparked public fury. Her presence had shaken the stone loose from a dam built on silence. And while Daniel Kessler's televised apology stood alone in tone, it cracked open something even deeper, moral permission. Suddenly others followed. A former data contractor who built models for candidate viability scoring released a sworn statement. A legislative intern confirmed overhearing a closed-door comment, "We're just sterilizing the ballot box." That phrase, when published in the New York Times, ignited protests not just in the streets, but in congressional offices. Staffers began walking out in symbolic protests. One aide to a Texas senator quit live on air saying, "I can't be the janitor cleaning up this legislative filth." But amid the swirl, Jasmine remained publicly calm. She refused every interview. She issued no tweets, no statements, no victory laps. When pressed by a CNN journalist outside her office for a comment on the broadcast, she paused, adjusted her folder, and said simply, "That wasn't a confession. That was a receipt." Then she walked away. No drama, just direction. Because in that moment, Jasmine Crockett understood what had shifted. She had gone from witness to catalyst. And now the system wasn't just answering to her. It was answering to itself. Somewhere across the country, a young black woman watched Daniel's confession from her one-bedroom apartment. She had once applied to run for city council, but backed out when she saw the fine print of eligibility. Tonight, she opened the tab again. Somewhere else, a war veteran who'd been disqualified due to an old housing voucher record wrote a letter to his representative with the subject line, "I'm not done." The confession hadn't just shaken Congress. It had given people permission to reclaim the fight. And Daniel? He was placed under federal protection after receiving multiple threats, but he told his lawyers, "I'm not running from this." He offered to testify under oath in the upcoming constitutional review. When asked if he feared retaliation, He said something Jasmine herself might have said. Fear is how this stayed hidden. I'm done giving it rent-free space in my life. As the week closed, no one knew how far this unraveling would go. But one thing was certain: silence was no longer an option. And in a nation built on amnesia, someone had finally chosen memory. After the televised confession and the surge of nationwide protests, something shifted, not just in the halls of power, but in the rhythm of the republic itself. The storm Jasmine had sparked was no longer a warning. It was an unstoppable reckoning. The vote was scheduled for noon, but by 9 a.m., every corridor in the Capitol pulsed with reporters, aides, lobbyists, and security. Inside the chamber, the silence was heavy, thick with the anticipation of a government about to confront its own reflection. Jasmine Crockett sat still, back straight, eyes steady, surrounded by allies who spoke in hushed tones, but followed her lead. She didn't need to speak yet. Her silence was strategic, measured. The crescendo was coming. On the marble steps outside, a crowd of nearly 20,000 had gathered. Vietnam veterans in faded jackets, immigrant mothers holding signs in Spanish and Vietnamese, young students with homemade banners that read, "This bill doesn't see me." Helicopters circled above. Every major cable network cut away from their regular programming to cover what had become the most consequential vote of the legislative year. At 12:02 p.m., the speaker called the chamber to order. The clerk's voice rang out, sharp and sterile. Roll call vote for the motion to suspend House Bill 2873, the Federal Integrity and Eligibility Reform Act. One by one, names were called. The giant digital board lit up. Green for aye, red for nay, yellow for abstention. For 10 seconds, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But then came the cascade. Green, 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 more green. By the time the tally reached 100, even the most seasoned political operatives began whispering to each other in disbelief. By the time it hit 200, gas broke out across the room. At 273, the speaker banged the gavel. Motion carried, the bill is suspended. The chamber erupted, not in chaos, but in controlled electricity. There were no cheers, no applause from Jasmine's side. Only the weight of validation. Jasmine exhaled. Not relief, confirmation. What she had fought was not just legislation, but a coded attack cloaked in bureaucracy. And now it was dead. But the story did not end there. Almost immediately, the Ethics Committee issued a formal press release from room 342B. The heading was brutal in its clarity. Formal investigation opened. Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene. Allegations of legislative abuse and racially discriminatory conduct. The statement cited 3 damning pieces of evidence. The internal file name of the draft bill, Project Eliminate Low-Base Candidates version 2.x.x, the anonymous testimony from a policy analyst, and the recently aired confession of a former Greene advisor who stated he had been ordered to run racial elimination algorithms. Together, they painted a picture not of accidental oversight, but targeted exclusion masked as reform. In the Capitol Press Gallery, phones buzzed nonstop as outlets from NPR to Fox scrambled to update headlines. On Twitter and Truth Social, the hashtag number Jim Crow by Design trended globally. Jasmine Crockett stepped to the rotunda just as the cameras turned to her. She didn't wear triumph like a crown. She wore it like armor. Let's be clear, she began, voice steady. This wasn't about me. It wasn't even about Marjorie. It was about what America thinks is worth protecting and who America thinks is worth excluding. She raised a folded copy of the bill into the air. This paper tried to say that your childhood poverty makes you ineligible, that your hunger as a student makes you unfit, that your struggle is a scar that disqualifies you from service. She paused, staring into the wall of cameras. But if that were true, none of our grandparents would have ever voted, and most of our heroes would have never led. Behind her, a slow rumble of applause grew, not just from Democrats, but independents, veterans, and even 2 Republican freshmen who had crossed the aisle. Meanwhile, Marjorie Taylor Greene was nowhere to be seen. Back in her office, blinds drawn and staff tight-lipped, she issued a 2-line statement via email. I only wanted the best for America. I regret that my intentions have been misunderstood. The public, however, wasn't buying it. Her previous quotes, "We don't need welfare queens in Congress," were replayed across networks. Her mockery of Jasmine's childhood, her dismissive tone about veterans who'd once needed food stamps, everything resurfaced. Even former allies began distancing themselves. One senator told Politico off record, "She went too far. She made it racial, then acted surprised when people saw it for what it was." Editorial boards across the country condemned her. Protesters gathered outside her district office holding mirrors with signs, "Look at what you built." Even in conservative strongholds, veterans groups began releasing statements. One retired Marine from Texas, who had voted for Greene twice, recorded a viral TikTok. "I received food stamps when I came home from Fallujah. If that makes me unfit for democracy, then maybe democracy forgot who it was built for." Meanwhile, legal scholars debated whether her conduct merited censure or expulsion. The House Ethics Committee began calling witnesses. Subpoenas were prepared. One staffer was overheard saying, "If she doesn't resign, the hearings will break her legacy in half." But Jasmine didn't linger on the scandal. Her mind was already on the next battle. Outside the Capitol, she found a quiet spot near the World War II memorial and sat beside a black woman in a wheelchair, holding a sign. "I served. I struggled. I still matter." Jasmine knelt beside her. "You do," she whispered. "You all do." In that moment, without podiums or cameras, she looked not like a congresswoman, but a daughter of the same story. One who had refused to let injustice speak louder than truth. And across the country, from kitchens in Detroit to classrooms in Phoenix, her words lived on. If laws are built to erase your path before you even begin it, then they were never laws. They were barriers. In the aftermath of the vote, as the dust settled across Capitol Hill and the protests quieted to whispers of legacy, there was still one thing left to be said, and only Jasmine could say it. The nation held its breath. Every network cut to a live feed from the east steps of the Capitol. The podium had no banner, no party insignia, only the seal of the United States and a single sheet of white paper resting in front of the microphone. Jasmine Crockett approached it slowly, methodically, as if each step held the weight of the people she carried with her. Veterans, single mothers, public housing survivors, dreamers who had been told their past made them ineligible. Her suit was charcoal gray, crisp, tailored with the sharpness of someone who knew the moment was not hers, but history's. Her eyes scanned the horizon, rows of reporters, clusters of civilians, camera drones hovering mid-air like silent sentinels. A light breeze passed, lifting the corner of the paper. Jasmine held it down with one hand, the other gripping the edge of the podium, as if anchoring herself to the ground she had just redefined. Then she spoke. "I want to be clear," she began, voice even, steady, not the tone of a victor, but of a woman delivering a verdict from the soul. "I did not fight this bill to represent my group. I fought it for every single person who has ever been told, directly or indirectly, that their pain disqualifies them from power." The crowd fell into stillness. For the girl in South Memphis who shares a mattress with two siblings but still dreams of Congress. For the boy in El Paso whose father was deported and who still believes in this flag. For the woman in Atlanta who raised 3 children on food stamps and still showed up to vote, despite knowing the system was never designed with her in mind. She leaned in. "This bill tried to turn their struggle into a stain, but we turned it into a standard. The standard that democracy isn't inherited, it's earned, by truth, by endurance, by rising even when the world tells you not to." A tear welled in the eye of a veteran standing in the second row. "I didn't fight this because I wanted a seat. I fought it because I wanted the floor, open to all, closed to none. Because if we define eligibility by how easy your life has been, we will never again be governed by the people, only by the privileged." Her voice broke slightly, then hardened. "And that is not democracy. That is aristocracy wrapped in a flag it does not deserve." The cameras zoomed in. Behind her, a massive screen projected a still image. Jasmine holding the now defeated bill, high above her head, with her other hand forming a fist not of defiance, but of declaration. Beneath it, in bold letters, her words, "I didn't fight to represent my group. I fought so everyone deemed ineligible could still dream." and still run. A hush swept over the gathering like a sacred pause. In living rooms from Chicago to Charleston, tears flowed freely. On Twitter, her quote trended globally under number right to run. Schools began printing posters of it. College classrooms held discussion panels. Law professors rewrote syllabi. Even critics, forced to reckon with what had unfolded, conceded. This was not about left or right anymore. This was about who gets to be seen as American. Weeks later, the National Museum of Civil Rights unveiled a new wing, the Modern Fight. Its final exhibit stood in a marble rotunda under a dome of soft, diffused light. At its center, a massive slab of obsidian granite, cut clean and smooth, like a monument to contradiction, pain and pride, exclusion and resistance. Etched into the stone, Jasmine's words gleamed in gold leaf. I fought so everyone deemed ineligible could still dream and still run. Next to it, a 9-foot-tall image, Jasmine Crockett on the Capitol steps, wind tugging at the hem of her jacket, one hand raised high with the crumpled bill, the other clutched over her chest. Visitors whispered in reverence. Some cried. Others stood in stunned silence. School children took notes. A black teenage girl stared at the wall for a full 5 minutes before softly asking her teacher, "Can I be her someday?" Her teacher smiled. Number, you can be you, but now you can get there. Meanwhile, Congress passed a new transparency statute requiring racial impact studies on all eligibility laws. States began reviewing similar legislation. One by one, dominoes fell. In Mississippi, a voter ID law was paused. In Arizona, a residency requirement bill was revoked. The ripples had become waves. Jasmine, however, returned to her district with little fanfare. No interviews, no victory lap. Just quiet community town halls and handwritten thank you notes to the people who stood with her. In one letter, she wrote, "You don't need to be in Congress to change a country. You just need to remind it who it belongs to." In the following year, a record number of women of color filed to run for federal office, many of them citing Jasmine's floor speech as their turning point. PACs shifted focus. Grassroots donors surged. A new wave was rising, not of rage but of resolve. And Marjorie Taylor Greene? Her ethics hearings dragged on. Allies abandoned her. Donors dried up. She lashed out on social media, blaming cancel culture and radical Marxists. But the public had already tuned her out. She became a cautionary tale of overreach, of coded cruelty, of what happens when power is used to gatekeep rather than guide. And Jasmine, she didn't just survive the storm, she became its thunder. The stone had been carved, the law defeated, and the cameras dimmed. But even after the headlines faded, one truth remained. What Jasmine Crockett had ignited was far more than a political reckoning. It was a moral awakening. In the echoes of that final speech, America was forced to look in the mirror, not at its symbols, but its systems. Jasmine's journey had exposed something far more insidious than one bill or one voice. The quiet cruelty of exclusion masked as merit. The lesson wasn't simply about race or class, it was about what we call worthiness, and who gets to define it. In fighting for those discarded by the rules, Jasmine reminded the nation that justice must extend beyond those who've always had access to it. That struggle, poverty, and imperfection don't disqualify someone from leadership. They qualify them for it. Her courage dismantled the myth that only the unscarred deserve to speak, lead, or run. Because true democracy isn't built by the perfect, it's built by the persistent. And sometimes the most powerful laws are not those passed in Congress, but those rewritten in the conscience of a country. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. In front of 17 million live viewers, Jasmine Crockett takes on Jeanine Pirro, the former Fox News judge turned federal nominee, over a past riddled with buried cases and political favors. Inside the Capitol, tension explodes as Crockett reveals a suppressed 2000 investigation, a leaked recording, and one damning testimony from Pirro's own aide. A motion is filed. Allies retreat. The hearing spirals into national crisis. But when Crockett drops her final line, the room freezes. Was this justice served, or the fall of a woman who thought she was untouchable? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The Capitol had seen its share of controversies, but nothing like this. When the president named Jeanine Pirro, the firebrand Fox News host turned judicial pundit, as interim U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia, the move ignited a firestorm. Supporters painted her as a legal warrior, a woman who spoke hard truths and didn't flinch. They flooded the airwaves with clips of her pounding her desk on live TV, shouting about justice and loyalty. But to others, especially civil rights advocates and legal ethics boards, this wasn't bravery. It was recklessness. They warned of a politicized prosecutor with a history of blurring the line between courtroom and cable news. The past couldn't be ignored. Pirro once used her office to spy on her own husband, and her time on television was laced with partisan fire. Into this chaos stepped Congress, announcing a full-scale ethics hearing. This wasn't just vetting a nominee. It was a battle over whether the justice system could still be trusted. In the center of the storm stood Jasmine Crockett, a rising force on the House Judiciary Committee. She had become a lightning rod for those demanding accountability. While others hesitated, she spoke with fire. "Justice isn't a television show," she declared to a sea of flashing cameras, "and we won't let it be hijacked by someone who treats it like one." Her words cut through the static like a blade, and within hours, the press locked onto the clash. Crockett versus Pirro became a national headline, echoing across every network and newsfeed. In this hearing, the stakes weren't just legal, they were existential. One woman stood for order, the other for outrage. One believed justice was earned, the other had sold it for ratings. And as the doors to the hearing room opened, the air inside snapped with tension. Every light burned hot, every lens locked on. And at the center, two women prepared to face off, not just for position, but for the soul of the law itself. And then it happened, the quiet rupture before the storm. As the last whispers dissolved into static and the cameras adjusted for the moment they had waited hours to capture, the chamber doors opened with theatrical precision. What entered was not humility, not accountability, but control, wrapped in tailored confidence. Jeanine Pirro walked into the hearing room like she'd been here 1,000 times. Only this time, the courtroom was hers before she even sat down. Her stride was steady, surgically confident, heels slicing through silence as though each step erased the very notion that she could be questioned. She wore power like a costume, her blazer pressed so sharply it looked sculpted, her makeup flawless under the unforgiving floodlights, her eyes unblinking and predatory. She didn't look like a public servant. She looked like a performer stepping into a final act she'd already rehearsed. Her gaze swept across the committee dais, not with apprehension, but assessment, measuring who might bend, who might break, and who dared to challenge her. Then her eyes met Jasmine Crockett's, and for a beat, the entire room seemed to freeze in that invisible clash of legacies. The woman who had risen from civil rights battles now faced the woman who once shouted over legal nuance for television ratings. And in that moment, Pirro didn't blink. She smirked. She waited for the noise to return, for cameras to adjust their zoom, and when it did, she leaned into the microphone with the theatrical poise of someone who had mastered optics. "I have served justice my entire life," she said, her voice unwavering, rich with rehearsed conviction. "And no one has the authority to question my allegiance to the law." She didn't just say it. She carved it into the air, word by word, like the final line of a closing argument delivered to a jury she believed already belonged to her. The statement wasn't a defense, it was a dare, a warning to anyone in the room thinking of peeling back the curtain. It was the kind of line built not for truth, but for prime-time replay. For a second, there was only silence, not out of respect, but out of calculation, because everyone in the room, including Jasmine Crockett, understood what had just happened. Jeanine Pirro hadn't walked in to be vetted. She had walked in to conquer. But as Jeanine Pirro's final words echoed through the chamber like a gavel in a hollow courtroom, Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't blink. Because in her hands wasn't rhetoric, it was evidence. and truth doesn't ask for permission to speak. Jasmine Crockett moved with the kind of precision that silences even ambition. She didn't raise her voice or lean forward theatrically. She didn't need to. Instead, she opened a slim manila folder with the deliberate calm of a surgeon about to make the first incision. The rustling of paper sliced through the tension like a blade. "For the record," she began, her voice steady and sharp as polished steel, "this committee is tasked with evaluating not just the legal expertise of a nominee, but their ethical spine." She lifted a sheet of paper and held it just high enough for every camera in the room to capture its bold heading. United States versus Albert Pirro. Her tone never wavered. "This is the federal indictment of Albert Pirro, former husband of the nominee before us. 29 months in federal prison for conspiracy and tax evasion, totaling more than $1 million in fraud." Her eyes flicked to Janine just once, not in hostility, but in surgical focus. "And yet," she continued, "Ms. Pirro never once recused herself from prosecutorial decisions involving parties directly linked to his business or financial entanglements." The air in the hearing room grew colder, not figuratively, but palpably, like the oxygen itself had thickened into judgment. Staffers froze mid-note. Reporters stopped typing. The red recording lights on camera rigs glowed hotter now, tighter. One lens zoomed in so closely on Pirro's face you could see the faint twitch at the corner of her jaw. Gone was the practiced smile. Gone was the poised defiance. What remained was something far more human. Recognition. Because Crockett hadn't made a political statement. She had presented a pattern. "Ethics is not about what's illegal," Crockett said, voice unwavering. "It's about what's unacceptable." She placed the document flat on the desk with a finality that reverberated. "And I ask this body to consider whether someone who knowingly remained entangled in conflicts of interest, who never once stepped back even when justice demanded distance, should be trusted with the highest prosecutorial authority in our capital." For a moment, the silence wasn't just uncomfortable, it was punitive. It was the sound of a mask cracking, and Jasmine Crockett hadn't even raised her voice. The weight of Crockett's accusation had just settled across the room like a thundercloud. But before the full force of it could crash down, Janine Pirro struck back with a tone of defiance that tried to reclaim control, unaware that Jasmine wasn't finished. She was only tightening the noose. "I cannot," Janine Pirro said, her voice crisp, her spine perfectly straight, "be judged for the mistakes of another person." She paused, carefully placing her palms on the table, as if anchoring herself physically before the waves rolled in. "I am not on trial for the sins of a former spouse. My ex-husband's legal troubles are his. I was not convicted. I was not charged. And I will not allow this committee to drag me through the mud for something I did not do." Her voice rose ever so slightly, not into a shout, but into a performance, tailored for the cameras now panning in tighter. It was the familiar rhythm of someone who had spent years commanding the attention of millions at 8 p.m. Controlled outrage, weaponized victimhood, calculated clarity. "I have served the public with integrity," she continued, "and no one has ever questioned my legal standing or my commitment to the law, until now, when it's politically convenient to do so." She was aiming for applause. What she got was a silence so taut it felt like glass waiting to shatter. Jasmine Crockett didn't move. She let the words sit, heavy in the air, allowed them to echo off the marble and the congressional seal behind her. Then slowly she leaned forward, not with aggression, but precision. Her tone wasn't loud, but it was surgical. "You're absolutely right, Ms. Pirro," she began. "You were not charged with your husband's crimes, but that's not what this committee is examining today. This hearing is not about guilt. It's about judgment." She flipped open the second folder on her desk. It was thicker than the last, more substantial. Inside, pages were flagged in yellow and red, with hand-scribbled notes in the margins. Crockett slid one of the pages out with the care of someone handling a live wire. "We're here to determine whether a nominee for the highest prosecutorial position in this city understands and respects the ethical limits of power. Because while you weren't convicted of fraud, you did something that goes even deeper than legal wrongdoing. You blurred the line between personal revenge and public authority." Crockett raised the document slowly, turning it just enough so every camera and every eye in the room could see the heading. Internal Memo, Westchester County District Attorney's Office, Confidential. The date was June 14, 2006. Her voice sharpened like drawn steel. This is a directive, signed by one of your senior investigators. It orders surveillance, state-sanctioned surveillance, of your then-husband, Albert Pirro. Murmurs erupted instantly across the chamber. Staffers glanced at each other. Senators straightened in their chairs. Even seasoned aides in the back row leaned forward, suddenly alert. This surveillance wasn't initiated to protect the public, Crockett continued, eyes locked on Pirro now. It wasn't tied to a public safety threat, a terrorism lead, or even a white-collar crime case. It was, according to this memo, motivated by suspicions of infidelity and the potential for legal exposure that might embarrass your office. The blow didn't come like a thunderclap. It came like a slow, precise incision, quiet, but impossible to ignore. Pirro's jaw tightened. Her expression, moments ago defiant and composed, now shifted, just slightly but undeniably, into something colder, something calculated. Her lips parted as if to speak, but Crockett didn't stop. "You weaponized your office to monitor your own husband," she said, her voice steady, not accusatory, but resolute. "You used government resources, meant for the pursuit of justice, as a tool for personal gain. You weren't seeking to uphold the law. You were protecting your image. You were building a case against someone in your own household while wearing the seal of public trust." A reporter dropped their pen. The faint click echoed like a gunshot. In the gallery, a cameraman whispered, "She just buried her." But Crockett wasn't burying anyone. She was exposing something, rotted and real. She set the document down and tapped her finger gently against its corner, as if punctuating a sentence that would never leave the record. "What matters to this committee," she said, her gaze unwavering, "is not just whether a nominee has broken the law, but whether they've demonstrated a pattern of ethical disregard. Because the power you are now asking for, the authority to prosecute Americans in the capital of this nation, demands more than a resume. It demands restraint. And Ms. Pirro, based on your own actions, restraint is precisely what you lacked." She let the words hang like storm clouds over marble. Every sound in the room vanished. No rustling papers, no shifting chairs. Only the thrum of air conditioning and the sound of a nation watching through screens. Pirro didn't respond immediately. Her silence wasn't strength. It was calculation, damage control. But the damage was already done. Crockett had carved open the facade with documentation, testimony, and a truth too uncomfortable to spin. She didn't need volume. She didn't need fury. She had facts and the floor. And at that moment, the power Pirro once commanded on television meant nothing. Because here, in this hearing, the only thing louder than words was the sound of truth finding its voice. The silence in the chamber was deafening, but outside those grand oak doors, the impact was already spreading like a wildfire through Washington's concrete veins. Jasmine Crockett's precision didn't just pierce Jeanine Pirro's armor, it cracked the illusion entirely, and what came next wasn't a ripple. It was an institutional reckoning. It began with a letter, just one, signed by the Legal Ethics Consortium, a group of seasoned attorneys and judicial scholars known for their measured tone and reluctance to engage in political spectacle. But this wasn't careful diplomacy. This was a red alert. In bold font, it called for the immediate suspension of Jeanine Pirro's nomination, citing historical misconduct, demonstrated misuse of public office, and ethical negligence incompatible with federal prosecutorial duty. The letter was hand-delivered to every member of the Senate Judiciary Committee within 12 hours of the hearing. By dusk, 3 more watchdog groups had followed suit. The Government Accountability Forum submitted a 14-page complaint detailing years of Pirro's alleged ethical breaches, including her personal surveillance directive and her entanglements with right-wing advocacy donors during her time as a judge. They didn't ask questions. They drew conclusions. Ms. Pirro has shown a pattern of substituting personal agenda for impartial law enforcement, the letter stated bluntly. She is unfit for any role in the Justice Department, let alone its most public-facing district. What followed wasn't a political debate. It was a siege. National headlines turned, not gradually, but violently. Every major paper that had remained neutral suddenly found itself overtaken by a tide of public concern. The Washington Post ran an above-the-fold editorial titled, "Justice or Theater? Where does Jeanine Pirro belong?" But it was the New York Times that dropped the gauntlet. The editorial wasn't simply critical, it was surgical. Its headline alone sent tremors down K Street. "Law in the hands of a talk show host?" The piece began with a brutal first line. "The United States Attorney's Office is not a segment of cable news, and Jeanine Pirro is not the custodian of impartial justice." It traced her entire trajectory, from bombastic monologues on Fox News to her history of wielding the law like a sword for political messaging. The editorial's tone was unflinching. To place Ms. Pirro in charge of the most symbolically powerful prosecutorial office in America is not just reckless, it is dangerous. In a city where perception shapes reality, the damage was irreversible. Editorial boards across the country echoed the concern. The Chicago Tribune warned of a constitutional farce in the making. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution demanded immediate congressional reevaluation. And by nightfall, even conservative outlets began pulling back, hedging, hesitating, reframing. Inside the Republican Party, the division started quietly, with cold stares and nervous coffee briefings behind closed doors. But as the coverage widened and polling data began to trickle in, private discomfort turned into public fracture. The base was watching, yes, but so was the center, and the center was recoiling. One senior GOP strategist, speaking off the record to Politico, admitted the truth bluntly. "We didn't expect Crockett to land a direct hit, but this isn't just a hit, it's a hemorrhage." Senator Roland Pike of Georgia, who just 3 days prior had declared Pirro a model of legal grit, reversed course with a 2-line press release. "Given recent developments, I believe we must pause and reconsider. Ethics must always be our guiding principle." Within hours, others followed. Senator Alana Rhodes of Utah cited newly raised concerns and suspended her endorsement. Senator Wyatt Heller from Ohio withdrew support pending investigation. The Republican firewall, once impenetrable, had begun to erode in real time. And it wasn't erosion from outside. It was collapsing from within. The pressure didn't stop there. Committee aides were flooded with calls, emails, and public statements. Several state bar associations began reviewing Pirro's past conduct, prompted by citizen petitions that ballooned into the thousands overnight. Legal blogs dissected the internal memo Crockett exposed, with former prosecutors confirming that no district attorney should ever direct surveillance against a spouse without judicial oversight. It's a weaponization of the badge. On Capitol Hill, whispers intensified. Would the Judiciary Committee call for a pause? Would there be a secondary ethics review? Jasmine Crockett, for her part, said nothing. She didn't tweet. She didn't give victory interviews. She let the facts and the consequences do what they were always meant to do, stand on their own. And as staffers from both parties huddled in corners, reshuffling statements and recalculating press angles, it became clear that the narrative had shifted. No longer was this about whether Pirro was qualified. It was about whether a party, already fraying at the edges, could afford to stand behind a figure now dripping with controversy. And still, Pirro held her ground, on the surface. But those who watched her closely noticed the changes. Her once unbreakable smirk faltered during off-camera breaks. Her staff stopped handing out pre-written quotes, and her legal team, once confidently smiling from the gallery, began whispering with furrowed brows and folded notes. The walls were closing in, not from political theater, not from personal rivalry, but from the oldest force in democratic governance: accountability armed with evidence. And Jasmine Crockett? She remained in her chair, silent, composed, the folders closed in front of her. But the damage already written, already published, already irreversible. This wasn't scandal by hearsay. It was collapse by truth. And truth, when delivered with clarity and without compromise, has no expiration. The walls were already closing in, but Jasmine Crockett wasn't interested in just pressure. She wanted clarity. And sometimes clarity doesn't come from evidence or argument. Sometimes it comes from a voice that condemns itself. She stood with deliberate restraint, every movement choreographed not for drama, but for precision. Jasmine Crockett wasn't there to grandstand. She was there to reveal, to strip away the layers of performance and pride that had protected Jeanine Pirro for decades. With a quiet nod to the committee clerk, she gestured to a compact speaker resting at the edge of the desk. Her tone never wavered. "I'd like to submit into the record an audio file," she said, her words crisp, controlled. It was captured during a closed-door ethics seminar held in February of 2022, where several former prosecutors were asked to reflect on the neutrality of law. She didn't explain further. She didn't need to. A staffer tapped the play button, and for a beat there was only static. Then came the voice, clear, firm, unmistakably Pirro's. "I don't believe anyone can rule fairly without having a political worldview," the recording began. Her cadence was confident, matter of fact. "Justice doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's a tool, a weapon. Whether people admit it or not, if you don't walk into a courtroom with a side, you're already losing." There were no gasps this time, only stunned silence. The words didn't shout. They bled. One by one, heads turned toward Pirro at the witness table. She didn't move, but her knuckles tightened around the armrest of her chair. Her face, always prepared, always poised, began to harden at the edges, like porcelain under heat. Because this wasn't speculation. It wasn't media spin. It was her in her own voice, asserting that impartiality was a myth and that justice belonged to those who could bend it. Crockett waited, letting the silence breathe like oxygen before striking the match. "What you just heard," she said, her voice low but resonant, "is not a mistake. It wasn't a slip of the tongue. It was a belief, a doctrine, held by the very woman now asking to wield prosecutorial authority over the capital of the United States." She stepped forward, not pacing, but planting each word into the chamber like a flag. "This isn't about a policy disagreement. This is about the soul of justice itself, about whether we, as a nation, still believe that the law should stand above politics or be consumed by it." Her eyes swept the panel. Some looked down. Others locked eyes, unable to look away. Because if we confirm someone who openly believes justice must be guided by partisanship, then we are no longer defending the Constitution. We are rewriting it. She turned, this time speaking not just to the committee, but to the cameras, to the country. "Let me say this plainly. Justice cannot wear red. It cannot wear blue. It must stand above, cold and clear, even when it makes us uncomfortable, even when it costs us politically. Because once we allow the gavel to be guided by ideology instead of law, we don't just lose cases, we lose the very idea of fairness." Her final words came not with fury, but with unmistakable finality. No one should sit in judgment over others while believing that the law is merely another tool in a political arsenal. That's not justice. That's tyranny in disguise. She stepped back, the audio now silent, the room breathless. And across the chamber, Jeanine Pirro sat still, no longer defiant, no longer smirking, just still. Because in that moment, her greatest weapon, her voice, had become her undoing. The sound of her own voice, cold, partisan, damning, still lingered in the air like smoke. And though the chamber remained silent, the balance had already shifted. Jeanine Pirro knew it. Everyone knew it. So she did what people do when truth begins to cut too close. She went personal. Her posture stiffened, chin raised just enough to feign control, but the tremble behind her voice betrayed what was really unraveling. Jeanine Pirro turned from defense to offense, her tone laced with venom masked as authority. "Let's not pretend, Congresswoman Crockett," she said, her words slicing into the still air. "You speak as if you've carried the burden of the bench, as if you've shouldered the weight of a courtroom." Her eyes narrowed, daring Crockett to flinch. "You haven't sat in judgment. You haven't ruled on evidence. You haven't made a decision with a man's future hanging in the balance. You're good with a microphone, I'll give you that. But microphones don't deliver justice." It was a swing aimed at Crockett's credibility, not her argument, a jab at experience, designed to distract from the bleeding wound Pirro couldn't stop. And yet, what was intended as dominance came out as desperation. The kind of desperation that echoes louder in silence than in rage. Jasmine Crockett didn't lean back. She didn't shift in her seat. She simply let the moment hang, heavy, blistering, undeniable. Then she stood, not for effect, not for show, but because some truths deserved to be spoken from a full height. Her voice when it came was quiet, but lethal. "You're right about one thing," she said, locking eyes with Piero. "I haven't worn a robe. I haven't sat behind a bench with the weight of a gavel in my palm." She paused, not for dramatic tension, but for moral clarity. "Because I don't need robes to tell the truth. I don't need titles to know the difference between justice and power. I don't need a stage, a script, or a slogan to fight for the people who've never had a voice in the system." The chamber didn't move. The silence wasn't empty. It was electric. Then she delivered the line that would etch itself into the congressional record. "I don't need to read from a script to serve justice." The impact was instant, uncontainable. First a breathless beat, then a ripple of disbelief that turned into laughter. Not mocking, but stunned. It swept through the gallery like a gust through a dry canyon, followed by a burst of applause that broke protocol and shattered the last illusion of Piero's composure. The cameras caught everything. Crockett's steel gaze, Piero's faltering breath, the aides whispering behind cupped hands. The woman who had ruled television with an iron tongue now sat in a room where her power meant nothing. Her script was useless, and her legacy was under siege. Not by noise, but by poise. Crockett hadn't attacked. She had revealed. And in that room of judgment, Jeanine Pirro, for the first time in years, had nothing left to say. The laughter had faded, but what lingered was far more potent, a sense that beneath Jeanine Pirro's confidence lay a ledger of decisions not made, of justice denied. Jasmine Crockett knew that the real reckoning wouldn't come from a one-liner. It would come from peeling back the record, exposing the silences that had shielded power for far too long. Jasmine Crockett didn't waste time. She didn't need to. The moment had already turned, and now she leaned into the silence like a surgeon before an incision. "We've heard a lot today about experience," she said, her tone level but icy. "So let's talk about the record, not the one on camera, the one written in case files, in delays, in doors that never open." Her fingers moved methodically across a stack of folders labeled in red tabs, one for each instance, one for each omission. During Ms. Pirro's tenure as District Attorney of Westchester County, there were not one, not two, but 6 separate cases in which credible allegations were brought forward against sitting Republican officials. In each of those cases, charges were either deferred, declined, or allowed to languish until the statute of limitations expired. She lifted the first folder, opening it with the same restraint one might use to expose a long-buried wound. "Case file WDC 1174, she announced. "September 2000. The subject, State Senator Alan Riggs, accused of funneling over $300,000 in unreported campaign donations through shell nonprofits, several of which were later revealed to have direct financial overlap with PACs tied to Ms. Pirro's own political donors." She raised her eyes to meet the committee's. And what did the district attorney do? She delayed review, then quietly transferred the case to a subordinate office with no authority to prosecute. Her voice dropped a fraction. The case died. The money never returned. And Senator Riggs? He went on to host Ms. Pirro's re-election fundraiser the following spring. A low murmur passed through the chamber, this time not from the press gallery but from the lawmakers themselves. Crockett's next move was silent. She slid the next folder open, this one thicker, with a dozen exhibits clipped in place. Then there's case file WDC 1431. The subject, Mayor Charles Benton, accused of bribery, zoning fraud, and collusion with developers across 2 counties. Documents, whistleblower affidavits, were submitted directly to Ms. Pirro's office. Multiple, verified affidavits. Her voice didn't rise, but the weight behind it deepened. Yet no charges were filed, not a single subpoena, no depositions. Why? Because Mayor Benton sat on the finance board of Westchester First, a private committee that bankrolled over $75,000 of advertising in support of Ms. Pirro's judicial campaign. Pirro said nothing. She didn't reach for her mic. Her hands had tightened visibly, thumbs pressing against each other in a nervous loop. The cameras caught every twitch, every hesitation. Crockett wasn't accusing without evidence. She was drawing blood from the record itself. The pattern is undeniable, Crockett said firmly. When the subject was powerful and conservative, Ms. Pirro's office looked the other way. When the paper trail led toward her own political infrastructure, justice didn't just slow down, it stopped entirely. She let her gaze sweep across the room, not with self-righteousness, but with controlled outrage. And that is not prosecutorial discretion. That is complicity cloaked in procedure. The silence was pierced by a voice not from the gallery, not from a reporter, but from within the committee itself. Representative Elias Crane, a centrist independent known for his reticence, cleared his throat and spoke with crisp resolve. "Madam Chair," he said, "given the weight of these disclosures in their apparent documentation, I move that this committee initiate an independent ethics review into Ms. Pirro's conduct during her tenure as district attorney. Until such a review is completed, I do not believe this nomination should proceed." A wave swept through the room, not applause, not outcry, but something colder, something final. Jasmine Crockett said nothing more. She closed the folder and slid it to the edge of her desk, the motion as exact and damning as any gavel strike. What she had laid bare wasn't a single scandal. It was a philosophy, a legacy of selective silence, designed to shield the powerful and punish only the convenient. And now, for the first time, it was no longer hidden behind robes, titles, or monologues. It was in the light, and it was unraveling. As Representative Crane's call for an ethics review echoed through the chamber, the moment shattered any illusion that this was just another confirmation hearing. Beyond the marble walls of Congress, a media storm had already been unleashed, and the country was watching every second like a nation holding its breath. Across America, television screens glowed with live feeds from Capitol Hill. CNN cut its usual afternoon programming to run a chyron in blood red. Pirro under fire, hearing spirals into historic showdown. MSNBC, which had been running a panel on international diplomacy, abruptly shifted to a split-screen broadcast of Jasmine Crockett calmly dismantling decades of silence with a voice as controlled as it was lethal. Even Fox News, once Pirro's home turf, aired the hearing live, though with a noticeably defensive tone, anchors speaking in clipped, uncomfortable phrases. The footage showed Crockett laying out one ethics violation after another with surgical clarity, while Pirro sat motionless, her eyes no longer scanning the room, her shoulders sinking minute by minute under the weight of credibility she could no longer hold. But what happened next shifted the storm into a supercell. On live television, in real time, a new voice emerged, not from the committee floor, but from the past. Benjamin Raskin, a former assistant district attorney who had served under Pirro in Westchester County for over 6 years, appeared unexpectedly on MSNBC's afternoon legal panel. What began as routine commentary turned into an unscheduled bombshell. "I've remained silent for a long time," Raskin began, his voice low but resolute. "But watching what Congresswoman Crockett revealed today, those case files, those patterns, that's not new to me. I saw it. I lived it." There was a moment of silence in the studio, the kind that precedes something seismic. I remember being told directly by senior staff, "That one's off limits. He's a friend of the office." That wasn't discretion. That was suppression. The panel froze. The host blinked, then nodded slowly. "So you're saying there were deliberate instructions not to prosecute certain individuals based on political ties?" Raskin nodded. "I'm saying the DA's office wasn't always working for the law. Sometimes it was working for Janine." The internet erupted. Hashtags like Washington Pirro cover-up, Nyach Crockett truth, and justice on trial trended worldwide within an hour. Legal TikTok exploded with former law clerks dissecting the body language of Pirro's silence, comparing her posture in real time with known courtroom tactics of defense under duress. Twitter turned into a war zone, half the country retweeting Crockett's now iconic line, "I don't need to read from a script to serve justice," the other half scrambling to deflect, distract, or deny. But the damage wasn't partisan anymore. It was structural. Because when a former ADA breaks ranks live, It opens a door no amount of messaging can close. As dusk settled over Washington, two more former prosecutors joined the fray. On CNN's The Situation Room, former Deputy ADA Lena Marshall, once heralded as Pirro's rising star, appeared via video call from her Manhattan office. She looked exhausted, but certain. There were cases, she said, where we were told to wait, not because of lack of evidence, but because the subject was politically inconvenient. I tried to push back once, only once. After that, I was reassigned to juvenile misdemeanors. Her voice cracked slightly. We had the power to hold people accountable, but power, she added, is only dangerous when it stops being shared. And under Pirro, it stopped being shared a long time ago. The reactions in Washington were immediate and volatile. Senate staffers scrambled to draft new memos as phones rang nonstop inside committee offices. One Republican aide was overheard saying, "We're losing this. We're not just losing the nomination. We're losing the narrative." Meanwhile, Democratic leadership huddled behind closed doors, not in celebration, but in stunned acknowledgement that something larger than a single confirmation was happening. The hearing, meant to be routine, had become something else entirely, a televised courtroom of national conscience. Inside the hearing room, Jasmine Crockett remained silent through it all. She hadn't spoken in nearly 20 minutes. She didn't need to. Every new revelation only amplified what she had already laid bare. She sat with quiet intensity, her hands folded, watching as the system began doing what it rarely does, correct itself in real time. A single screen in the chamber, usually reserved for visual exhibits, now displayed a live MSNBC banner. Breaking, multiple former prosecutors accused Pirro of political interference. The room didn't cheer. It didn't clap. But something in the posture of the committee shifted, rigid lines softening, guarded eyes now wide open. Outside, protesters had gathered, some in support of Crockett, others stunned by the scale of what had been unearthed. Posters read, "No justice for sale," "The badge isn't a brand," and "Accountability has a name." Drone footage captured thousands outside the Capitol, footage that was replayed endlessly across primetime hours. And yet, in the heart of that storm, Jasmine remained steady. She wasn't reacting to the headlines. She had created them, not with sensationalism, but with precision, not with volume, but with verification. Back in the media centers, a quiet consensus began forming among analysts across the spectrum. One prominent legal commentator on Fox News, a longtime ally of Pirro, admitted on air, "This isn't a smear job. This is a well-documented dissection of her record, and frankly, it's one that leaves very little room for defense." The words "reluctant" and "grim" echoed through living rooms across the nation. Jeanine Pirro wasn't just in trouble, she was unraveling. And the walls weren't closing in because of a rival's ambition. They were closing in because of the truth. Unscripted, undeniable, unfolding live. As the hearing neared its final hour of coverage for the day, anchors across every network used the same word without prompting: historic. Not because of its scale, but because of its reversal. A former prosecutor turned pundit had entered the chamber expecting deference, and left exposed as a symbol of everything justice must not become. And it happened not through scandal, but through a calm, relentless dismantling by a woman who didn't shout, didn't insult, didn't gloat. She simply told the truth, one document at a time. And still, Jasmine Crockett hadn't said her last word. But America already understood the gravity of what she'd done. Because for the first time in years, truth didn't come from a news anchor. It came from a seat in Congress, in a voice that refused to be silenced. The media firestorm raged outside, and Pirro's silence inside the chamber grew heavier with every exposed detail. But Jasmine Crockett had saved one piece for last. Not a file, not a recording, but a man. And what he carried wasn't evidence. It was confession. The double doors at the rear of the hearing room opened without fanfare, but the energy in the chamber shifted instantly. In walked a man in his late 30s, dressed in a dark, rumpled suit that looked as if it had been agonized over before he stepped through that threshold. His hands clutched a simple folder, but it wasn't the paper he carried that made the room lean forward. It was the weight behind his steps. He moved slowly, deliberately, each stride toward the witness table echoing through the chamber like a countdown. Jasmine Crockett didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The air itself held its breath. The nameplate slid into position. David Reardon, former legal aide to DA Jeanine Pirro. He sat down, placed the folder in front of him, and cleared his throat. The microphone caught the tremor. "Thank you, Madam Chair," he began, voice tight but composed. "My name is David Reardon. From 2001 to 2005, I served as a junior legal aide in the Westchester County District Attorney's Office under Ms. Jeanine Pirro." His eyes scanned the room, landing briefly on Pirro, who stared ahead as if he weren't there. "In late 2003, I was handed a preliminary case file involving alleged embezzlement and real estate fraud, file number WDC-3981. The subject of that file was a man named Richard Kalman." He paused. "Mr. Kalman was, and to my knowledge still is, a close personal friend of Ms. Pirro." A ripple passed through the room like a cold wind through glass. Reardon exhaled slowly. "When I brought the file to my supervisor, I was told, verbatim, that file's not going anywhere. Bury it. I asked if we were waiting for further documentation. I was told no. I asked if another office would be taking over. I was told no. I asked if Ms. Pirro had been briefed. I was told she already had been, and that she had personally ordered the file shelved." The words didn't explode. They sank, slow and suffocating. The committee didn't move. Neither did Pirro. But the truth was out, and now it had a name. Jasmine Crockett, who had remained still through the testimony, finally leaned forward. Her voice was calm, almost gentle. "Mr. Reardon, are you prepared to submit that statement under penalty of perjury?" Reardon nodded. "Yes, ma'am, I am." She glanced briefly at the folder. "And the notes you brought today, are those your own documentation from that time?" "They are," he said. "Contemporaneous, dated, and notarized. I didn't come forward before because I didn't think it would matter. But what I saw in this hearing, what I saw you do with truth, I realized it was time." There was no applause, no exhale, just tension so thick it seemed to weigh on every shoulder in the room. Crockett gave a small nod, measured, controlled. "Thank you, Mr. Reardon," she said. Her eyes were steady, but her voice carried a subtle finality. "Thank you for choosing truth." It was more than gratitude, it was recognition, a line drawn between those who protect the system and those who protect themselves. The cameras caught it all, Reardon's steady breath, Crockett's gaze, and Pirro's stillness, now edged with something that looked almost like dread. The room sat in stunned stillness for several seconds longer than protocol would allow. Reardon lowered his eyes. The folder remained on the desk, untouched, glowing like radioactive material. What it contained didn't need to be read aloud. Its existence was enough. In that moment, Jeanine Pirro wasn't just a nominee under scrutiny. She was the subject of testimony, real, personal, damning, and there was no segment, no soundbite, no studio lighting that could reframe it. The truth had spoken. And this time, it wasn't coming from her lips. It was coming from someone who had once been told to stay silent and finally refused. Jasmine Crockett remained composed, but behind her stillness was a pulse that matched the nation's own. A collective realization that what had once been locked in sealed folders was now public record, and what had once been a name protected by prestige had now become a symbol of why the system must answer to those it was designed to serve. Not the powerful, not the connected, but the people. And at that table, for the first time in a long time, one of those people had chosen to speak. The confession had landed like a hammer, and as the silence deepened, it became clear this hearing was no longer about persuasion. It was about consequence. And when institutions are cornered by truth, their response is rarely quiet. It started with whispers in the corners of the chamber, staffers darting between seats, black folders handed off like relay batons, committee chairs leaning into hushed conversations behind tightly gripped microphones. Then the gavel fell again, not from the chairwoman, but from protocol. A special subcommittee, hastily formed under emergency ethics procedures, motioned to address the room. The lead, Representative Alice Monroe of Colorado, known for her judicial neutrality, rose to speak. Her voice, though calm, sliced through the chamber like steel. Given the gravity of the testimony presented today, the substantiated allegations of ethical misconduct and corroborated evidence of interference in selective prosecution, this body cannot, in good conscience, allow the nominee to proceed in an acting capacity while questions of legality and impartiality remain unresolved. The words were precise. They weren't inflammatory, they were surgical. Monroe continued, "Therefore, the Emergency Ethics Subcommittee recommends the immediate suspension of Ms. Janine Pirro's nomination and any acting prosecutorial authority, pending the completion of an independent investigation led by a neutral special counsel." Gasps broke out. Not performative, not political, but real. This was no longer just a hearing. This was a reckoning with legal consequence. Monroe submitted the motion in writing. All eyes turned to the ranking members. The line had been drawn. It was now on record. At first, the GOP members froze, visibly calculating the fallout. But outside those chamber doors, reality was already raging. Polling data had begun shifting in real time. Editorial boards from swing states had issued statements within the hour. The conservative base was no longer enough to protect what now looked indefensible. And so, one by one, the firewall cracked. Representative Halderman of Texas, one of Pirro's earliest supporters, cleared his throat and leaned into the mic. "In light of public interest and our duty to uphold institutional integrity," he said, eyes low, voice grudging, "I support the subcommittee's recommendation." Others followed, not with passion, not with pride, but with the grim acceptance that no party survives when it's seen as shielding corruption in plain sight. Across the aisle, Jasmine Crockett remained motionless, watching the shift unfold not with triumph, but with focus. This wasn't about her. It never had been. It was about the integrity of the office Pirro had sought to claim with showmanship and shadow. The camera zoomed in on the nominee, once a queen of broadcast thunder, now seated in near silence. Her shoulders tense, her breath shallow, her jaw clenched so tightly it seemed to shake beneath the skin. Still, she raised the mic. Her voice came clipped, sharp, not like someone defending their legacy, but like someone clawing to keep it. "This is a political hunt," Pirro spat, the words brittle with indignation. "This is retribution, not justice. A takedown scripted for the cameras and the headlines. I've spent my life fighting for the rule of law, only to be thrown to the wolves the moment my name no longer fits their agenda." She paused, looking around the room for affirmation. None came, not from her former supporters, not from the press, not even from the legal counsel seated quietly behind her. The moment was meant to reclaim her strength. It only revealed her isolation. For years, Pirro had controlled narratives with sound bites and spectacle. But here, under oath, under pressure, her story no longer belonged to her. It belonged to the record. And the record, now stained with testimony, documentation, and undeniable silence from her own allies, spoke louder than she ever could. The spotlight she once used to command had become a crucible, and no one was coming to pull her from the fire. The chamber remained still, but the tension screamed. There was no applause, no deflection, no rescue. Janine Pirro had declared herself hunted, but the truth, finally unburied and echoing through every corridor of Capitol Hill, had already pierced the armor. And this time, no headline could save her. The chamber had witnessed the fall of a giant, not through rage or vengeance, but through unwavering truth. And as the motion to suspend Pirro passed without objection, the room did not erupt, but it exhaled. In that breath, all eyes turned toward the woman who had made it possible. Jasmine Crockett stood slowly, not as a victor, but as someone carrying the solemn weight of a moment far larger than herself. There was no fist raised, no smirk, no premature celebration. She simply gathered her folders, those now famous files that had unraveled a legacy, and straightened her blazer with the quiet resolve of someone who knew that justice, when it lands, doesn't roar. It lands like thunder in the bones. As she stepped back from the microphone, the room stirred. A single clap broke the silence, then another, and another. Within seconds, a wave of applause swept across the hearing chamber, measured, restrained, but unmistakably reverent. Reporters stood. Staffers looked on, awestruck. Even members of the committee, long hardened by years of partisan crossfire, nodded silently as she passed. Crockett didn't pause to absorb it. She just kept walking. At the doorway, she turned once more, not to gloat, but to deliver what would become the closing line of a national reckoning. "The law," she said firmly, her voice amplified not by microphone, but by clarity, "is not a weapon for the powerful. It is where the powerless go to be heard." The silence that followed wasn't silence, it was tribute. Even Janine Pirro, still seated at the witness table, did not interrupt. She didn't raise her voice. She couldn't. That line, sharper than any cross-examination, more lasting than any headline, had already passed judgment. Not in rage, but in truth. Outside, the storm had broken. The Capitol steps, once empty, were now packed with onlookers, press crews, and citizen advocates who had been following the hearing minute by minute from the screens inside. As Crockett emerged through the towering doors of Congress, the sun broke momentarily through the clouds, casting a long, defined shadow at her feet. The cameras were already in position. ABC, CBS, MSNBC, and even Fox News, whose tone had shifted dramatically in the last 24 hours. They didn't shout questions. They didn't swarm. They simply followed her with lenses, as if trying to capture not a spectacle, but a shift in the atmosphere. The image was iconic. Jasmine Crockett descending the white stone steps, her face composed, the Capitol dome rising behind her like a monument to the very system she had dared to challenge from within. The sound that met her wasn't cheering. It was something quieter, but deeper. Respect, whispered thank yous from legal interns. A single man in a veteran's cap saluting from behind a barrier. Mothers holding their children a little higher so they could see. Signs that hadn't been raised in anger, but in faith. Justice is still possible. Truth needs no title. She spoke for us. No red carpets, no entourage, just the steady echo of her heels against the marble, the flap of flags in the wind, and the hushed awe of a country that had watched one woman go to war with institutional silence and win. But behind the poise, behind the clarity, Crockett felt the weight of having been underestimated, scrutinized, dismissed, of walking into a room not as a celebrated figure, but as a disruption, and of knowing that everything she had faced, every sideways glance, every snide whisper, every veiled warning, had led to this moment. She hadn't just held the line. She had redrawn it, not with power, with principle. As she reached the last step, she stopped briefly, turned to face the crowd, and let the cameras capture her in full. There was no podium, no teleprompter, just a woman standing beneath the nation's most iconic symbol of law, having just reminded the country what that law was meant to serve. One final sentence left her lips, spoken not into microphones, but into history. Justice is not loud, it's not partisan, and it's not always easy to find. But when it shows up, when it finally speaks, it never whispers. Then she turned, descended into the sea of press, protest, and praise, and disappeared into the moment, not as a politician, but as a symbol, a guardian of truth in the middle of a political storm. And though the storm had not ended, something fundamental had changed. The people had seen the system confronted by its own reflection, and for once, it had blinked. The cameras faded, the crowd began to thin, and Jasmine Crockett disappeared into the shadows of the Capitol. Not for victory laps, not for glory, but in the stillness that followed, the question echoed louder than any applause. What does this all mean when the lights go off? What remained after the hearings, the headlines, and the unraveling of a legacy was not just a political moment, it was a human one. Jasmine Crockett had stood alone against a tide of institutional loyalty, media spectacle, and partisan inertia. She had walked into that chamber carrying nothing more than a stack of unshakable facts and the will to speak when silence was the easier road. And for that, she had been attacked, dismissed, and personally ridiculed by someone with decades of power, influence, and reputation. But she hadn't flinched. Because the truth is, the real cost of telling the truth isn't in the words, it's in the consequences, in the threats that come after, in the isolation when allies vanish, in the smear campaigns that begin the moment you stand for something larger than yourself. That's the price of integrity in public service. And she paid it every minute of that hearing, with dignity so still it silenced an empire. The lesson wasn't written in law books or constitutional clauses. It was written in Jasmine's restraint, her refusal to shout even when shouted at, her decision to stand still when baited to explode, her choice to lead not with volume, but with verification. In an era where public discourse is often won by whoever speaks loudest or hits hardest, she reminded the nation that courage isn't a punch, it's a presence, that justice isn't always dramatic, it's patient, that truth doesn't beg to be heard, it simply waits for someone brave enough to say it. And sometimes that someone is the one who walks into the room least expected to win. But perhaps the most powerful lesson was this: that the law, stripped of robes and titles, is only as strong as the people who defend its purpose. It is not made righteous by tradition. It is made righteous by those who refuse to let it be twisted by power. And on that day, Jasmine Crockett didn't just challenge a nomination. She challenged the very idea that some people are too powerful to be held accountable. She proved that truth, when armed with discipline and moral clarity, can outlast arrogance, outmaneuver rhetoric, and outshine celebrity. And she did it not because it was easy, but because it was right. There was a moment, hours after the hearing, when Jasmine stood alone in her office. No cameras, no microphones, just the soft hum of a city still buzzing with the echoes of her words. She stared out at the Capitol dome glowing beneath the clouds, and for the first time all day, she allowed herself to breathe. It wasn't victory she felt. It wasn't vindication. It was something quieter, something harder, responsibility. Because once you tell the truth in a room built to deny it, you don't get to walk away clean. You carry that moment forward. You become the standard you set. And the next time the system tries to bury someone else, your silence becomes complicity. So you keep speaking. You keep standing, even when your voice trembles, especially then. For those watching across the country, students, single mothers, veterans, public defenders, journalists, working-class Americans who had given up believing the law could still work for them, what they witnessed wasn't just a political showdown. It was a living example of what it looks like when someone dares to confront corruption without becoming consumed by it. They didn't see a politician, they saw a protector. And in a time where truth feels fragile and institutions feel hollow, that image, that steady voice calling the law back to its purpose, was not just rare, it was necessary. And so the story left behind isn't about Jeanine Pirro. It isn't about a fallen nomination or a crumbled reputation. It's about a deeper truth, that justice isn't reserved for the powerful, and it doesn't belong to those with the biggest platform. It belongs to those who defend it when no one else will. That's what Jasmine Crockett taught the country that day. That's what echoed long after the chamber emptied. And that's the lesson the nation can't afford to forget. But Jasmine Crockett didn't stand before that committee just to deliver a moment of moral clarity. She stood there to light a fuse. What followed wasn't a conclusion, it was a call. Because history has never been moved by silence. It's been rewritten by those who refuse to sit still in the face of injustice. Now is the time to decide what kind of country we want to be. Not tomorrow, not next election cycle, not when it's convenient or safe or profitable. Now, Jasmine Crockett's courage inside that hearing room was not a performance. It was a declaration that law must serve people, not power. That truth still matters, even when it's surrounded by decades of noise. That the system we've been told is too rigged, too corrupt, too entrenched to ever change can be cracked open when one person decides to stop asking for permission and starts demanding accountability. She didn't do it with wealth. She didn't do it with a machine behind her. She did it with a folder full of facts, a voice steady with principle, and the kind of discipline that doesn't chase applause, it chases impact. But if her courage stays confined to that hearing chamber, then the system wins again. If we watch the headlines fade and let the outrage drift into memory, then we've learned nothing. Because for every Jeanine Pirro exposed, there are 10 more hiding behind the same robes, the same networks, the same politics. Justice doesn't need another viral clip. It needs a citizenry that refuses to let corruption become normal. That doesn't just admire truth from afar, but defends it in every room where it's under siege. You don't have to be a congresswoman to do that. You don't have to be a lawyer or a politician or a TV personality. You just have to show up. Every single day in every way that matters. That means showing up in city halls where developers buy silence while displacing families. That means showing up in school board meetings where curricula are twisted to erase truth and replace it with comfort. That means showing up at the polls where voter suppression isn't a historical relic, it's an evolving strategy. That means showing up for whistleblowers who risk everything to tell the truth while the system tries to chew them up and spit them out. That means showing up for journalists who are targeted for asking the wrong questions, for community organizers who are surveilled, for public defenders drowning in caseloads because justice is rationed like privilege. Let Jasmine's actions remind you, integrity is not institutional, it's personal. It doesn't live in marble buildings, it lives in people. And it only survives if we keep breathing life into it, day after day, headline after headline, even when the spotlight moves on. Especially then, because the machinery of injustice counts on us forgetting. It counts on short attention spans. It counts on our exhaustion. It counts on cynicism. It counts on that moment when we say, well, that's just how politics works. But when we normalize corruption, we forfeit democracy. When we shrug at abuse of power, we invite it into our homes. When we stay silent in the face of suppression, we surrender the future. But here's the truth that scares the powerful the most. We are not powerless. Not when we organize, not when we vote, not when we call out judges, prosecutors, pundits, and lawmakers who hide behind title while selling out principle, not when we show up in numbers too large to ignore, not when we demand that justice be blind, not selectively deaf. Jasmine Crockett didn't just prove that speaking truth to power still matters. She reminded us that it's contagious, that when one voice cracks the silence, others follow, that when one person chooses courage over comfort, the entire foundation begins to shift. So let this moment be more than outrage. Let it be a spark. Let it be the day we stopped outsourcing our responsibility to fix what we already know is broken. Let it be the day we stopped waiting for someone else to clean up a mess we helped create by staying on the sidelines. Let it be the day we started treating democracy not as a spectator sport, but as a fight we have to re-enter over and over, even when we're tired, even when we're angry, even when it feels impossible. Because the truth is, the system will not save us. It never has. It was built to protect itself, to protect wealth, to protect power. It will write off every Jasmine Crockett as too emotional, too young, too inexperienced, too loud, too black, too bold, because it cannot afford to let someone like her redefine what justice looks like. But she already has. And now it's up to us to carry it forward. That means asking hard questions in quiet rooms. That means standing up for the employee who gets punished for telling the truth. That means calling out the judge whose conflicts of interest have gone unchecked. That means demanding transparency in local budgets. That means teaching our children that patriotism is not blind loyalty. It's courageous dissent. That means refusing to forget the names of the people steamrolled by silence. That means remembering that democracy is not guaranteed by documents. It's upheld by action. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.